Hello everyone, I'm Killer Cube, and this is part 3 of the map making tutorial series where I will be teaching you guys how to connect your input events with player actions and how they actually correspond with each other. Let's go ahead and get started right away. Now we're going to go ahead and start heading over to our command block area with the command block that was underneath our spawn. So we're going to go ahead and click the button, and it's going to send us to our command block area. And right here we have the 4 events that we made in the previous video. Now I went ahead and set up a simple diagram, and this diagram shows how our input events will be corresponding to the player actions. In our case, let's say we have left and right inputs, and each one will do a simple action, and this simple action will just be set the x-axis to +1 or -1. And this might be confusing, but in simple terms, this means our graph, or if you think of the x and y axis, we have the negative direction and the positive direction. And this is simply setting the direction in which our player character will be going on that axis. So if it's the right input, then we expect our player to move on the positive x-axis. Whereas if it's the left input, then it is expected to move on the negative x-axis. And this is all set and is inputted into our player. So that's the portion that we want to set up so that we can read and set these values for our x and y axis. Now, to begin this step, I went ahead and grabbed myself an armor stand, and we're going to need this to set up a game dummy, or a character that will contain scoreboard values for us. And this might be confusing, but in simple terms, it's basically a storage device. We use him to store values inside of, that way we can use them in target selector arguments. So we're going to go ahead and grab an anvil, and we're going to name this armor stand game. That sounds good enough to me. All lowercase. It doesn't really matter if it's capital or lowercase, but here we go. We have our player character right there. And that's going to be our little dummy for any values we want to store inside the game. Now we need to correspond each one of these events with adding a value to the game. Let's go ahead and set up a scoreboard, because this is what we're going to store values inside of. We're going to go ahead and do scoreboard, objectives, add, and we're going to make a new scoreboard objective, and we're just going to name this, we're going to have one for the x-axis. I'm not sure if it's going to allow that dash, but we'll find out. So we're going to have one for the x-axis, and we just type in dummy because we're not going to have a display name. These are going to be hidden. Yep, that works. And then we're going to go ahead and set one up for the y-axis. And we want to set the game's value on the x-axis and the y-axis to +1 or -1 to display where the player is going to be moving. Now, it actually might be a smarter idea to name this armor stand to player, but our game's going to be really controlling everything, so I just named mine game, but if you want to, you can also name it player. So in our case, let's go ahead and set the display of this scoreboard so that we can see this objective. Set display, and we're going to go ahead and set it to the sidebar, and we're just going to go ahead and view the x-axis for now. And it doesn't matter if it's ascending or descending, but there we go. Now we can see x-axis, but there are no values for it. We don't have 0 or -1 or any value on there. So now we need to correspond these events with setting a value for the game player on that x-axis scoreboard. Now I set up a nice little grid for me, or not a grid, but 2 axes. We have the y-axis and the x-axis, and this is the one we're going to be focusing on, which is just so happened to be left and right. This is up and down, but we're probably going to be changing that to forward and backwards because those are the dimensions in which we have controls for. So if we go ahead and head back to our spawn, and come over to where our box was and see our controls and the outputs for the events that we get, if I can find the box up right here. And we're going to go ahead and go inside of the box and see which outputs we get, if I can fly into the hole. There we go. So if we move right here, that's forwards. So right there is forwards, that direction. This is left, this is right, and this is backwards. Okay, so in our case, the z-axis, as you can see if I move back and forth, left and right, the z-axis is actually our x-axis. So it sounds confusing, but the corresponding, this axis right here is going to be corresponding to our x-axis. So let's go ahead and mark these axes. And that's a lot of axes, I'm just saying. And these two colors correspond to which axis we are on. So up and or forward and backwards is our green color, which will be our y-axis, and red will be our x-axis, which is left and right. And so now we need to go ahead and start adding the inputs into our game, where it will set the game or the game dummy to a -1 or a +1 on that x-axis scoreboard. Now, to set up this armor stand's value on the x-axis and the y-axis scoreboards, we're going to need to correspond each one of these events with a scoreboard set value. And we can do that if we type in the chat scoreboard players set, and we can actually do an @e with target selector arguments. And we're going to go ahead and say if the name is equal to game, and for extra protection, just in case somebody's name is game and they join your game, which would be kind of funny, we're going to go ahead and also do type equals, and then we're going to do armor stand. Oop, stand. And then we're going to close that off with an end square bracket, and we're going to go ahead and do this on the x-axis. And we're going to go ahead and set their value to whatever value we want to. In our case, let's go ahead and set it to 0, not -1. And as you can see, this huge number pops up with a red 0 at the end. That huge number is actually this armor stand's UUID. It's a specific ID given to every entity in your game. This ID does not matter. What does matter is that red 0 at the end. That is what we are focused on. That's the value given to this armor stand when we set its value to 0. So if we go ahead and set it to -1, you'll see that it's -1. That's what's important. If we set it to 1, you'll see it's 1. So that red number at the end is actually the value that's stored on our armor stand. The long number in the front is actually just the UUID of the armor stand. You might be asking, why is it not the name of the armor stand? Well, the reason it's not the name is, to be honest, I'm not sure either. I think it's because multiple armor stands can have the same name, so in order to prevent overlapping, they went ahead and used the ID instead. So I think that's the idea that's happening there. But as you can see, we now have the number 0 stored in the x-axis. So let's go ahead and correspond these events to a scoreboard set operation. So in order to do this, we're just going to go ahead and change these say statements to scoreboard players set @e type equals armor stand, and we're going to go ahead and expand this armor stand. We're going to go ahead and say the name equals game in quotation marks, and we're going to go ahead and set their x-axis value to -1 because this is the left event, as you can see. So when we click left, it's going to set the x-axis to -1. And then we're going to go ahead and do that for the right one too. But we're going to change it from -1 to a +1. There we go. And we're going to go ahead and do this for the backwards and forwards events, which shouldn't be too hard. We can just change the y-axis and make it +1 because this is the forward and positive is usually forward. Negative is going to be the backwards. So we're going to go ahead and set that to a negative. There we go. So now our inputs correspond to setting the value of our armor stand. So let's go ahead and check that out real quick, and we can actually see it in action when we go to our little game board over here. So if we go ahead and stop by, where is it? Always gotta find it. There we go. So we're gonna go ahead and go inside of it. There we go. And let's go ahead and see if this worked. So right equals 1, and as you can see, perfect. As you can see, our forward and backwards we can't actually view, but we can set the, if we go back to our sidebar, we can set it to Y, and you can view the y-axis too. So forward and backwards should be setting that to 1 and -1. As you can see, works perfectly. And that's what we want. Now we can actually use those values inputted into our player, and we'll have a nice little input system. So let's go ahead and just set that up real quick. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this axis markers now that we already have this done. And we're going to go ahead and display. We're going to go ahead and disable that display. So you can just do set display sidebar and then nothing after it. It will get rid of the sidebar for you. Now, if you don't want to destroy those axes, that's up to you on your game board. If you want to keep them, that's a smart idea though, because those correspond to each axis. I remembered mine. In my case, it's Z is the x-axis and X is the y-axis. And that's confusing. If you want to, I also recommend for you guys to name your axes the axis in which the game is actually moving. In my case, I ended up naming it the Y and X axis, but the board has the Z axis corresponding to the X, and the X axis corresponds to the Y. So that's a little bit weird, so you might want to write that down somewheres. So I'm going to go ahead and actually just write that down for myself. Now that we have a good understanding on our inputs, and now that they are in axis form, so now we have two values corresponding to both axes, we can actually use that to move our player. But we're going to need our game loop. And in our game loop, it's actually going to be pretty simple. I'm not sure if I can select that, but we're going to go ahead and grab an armor stand. Okay, and we're going to go ahead and grab a dragon head, and we're going to go ahead and place our armor stand. This is going to be our pretend player. And if we go ahead and place our head on there, you're going to notice our dragon head is now on our player. Now, in our case, in Snake, we actually move only on one axis. So this is a bug with our system that we made, but that's going to be an easy bug to fix, and I'll show you how to fix it. And how our player will move is based on every game tick. So we're going to need a game loop, which will act like a redstone clock. So if you think of it, if we go ahead and grab some redstone here, if you've ever seen one of these little doohickeys, where you can take repeaters and clock them like this, and go ahead and break the redstone really quickly, you'll notice that it's repeating super quick. But it's at a constant rate. This is what we call a clock. It's because every so number of times it will activate. So there is never a moment where it's slower than the other. So that's what we need in our command blocks. We need a constant clock that will move our player depending on which axis is +1 or -1, and that's what we need in order to do this entire operation. So first, we need to fix that bug where the player can only move on one axis at a time. We can't actually move on both axes. So in order to do this, we actually just want to set the axis to 0. 0 means the player will not be moving on that axis. That's why I use -1 and +1 and not -1 or +1 and 0. That's why I used those two values. So we're going to go ahead and place another conditional command block. And all this is going to do is run the same as the event. And we're going to go ahead and set the opposite. As you can see, it says y-axis equals 1, where we're going to do the same thing, and we're going to set the x-axis to 0. And the way we do this, I'm just going to go ahead and copy, and I'm going to get rid of the title because it's not important to have the event. And we're going to go ahead and set the x-axis to 0. As you can see, and we're going to go ahead and do that for the other one too, which is the backwards, and we're going to go ahead and set the left and right as y-axis set to 0 because we're moving on the x-axis. And we're going to go ahead and copy that and just paste it. There we go. Come over back to our box. I'm going to go ahead and set the display. You guys probably don't need to do this, but if you want to debug it, go ahead, just in case. So I'm going to go ahead and set the sidebar back up. Moving forward and backwards, we'll set our x-axis to 0. Left and right, we'll set it to 1. And this is very useful because now we get to, a single direction where our player moves. Awesome. We're nearing the end of our video, but let's go ahead and set up a game loop which will run every so ticks and read whatever the output of the x-axis scoreboard and the y-axis scoreboard is, and it will make it into player movement. So in our case, we're going to go ahead and set up our game loop right beside our game events. We're going to go ahead and name this command block game loop, and we're going to set it to an infinitely repeating command block, always active, and we're going to go ahead and set a delay in ticks, and I think ½ a second is pretty good. So every ½ a second this will clock. That's going to be corresponding to our player's speed. So if it's a ½ a second, that's probably how fast our player is going to move, every ½ a second. Every ½ a second it's going to move a block. So that sounds about good. We can always speed it up later. And inside of this command block, we can run whatever we want on loop. Now, it works very similar to the events where they will constantly look for each value, but these are async, aka they run every single tick no matter what the game loop is doing. And that's very important because we want to get these events before the game loop hits its next clock, because we don't want the player to move forward and then find out the snake's not moving forward until the next move on the game loop, which is very irritating. So we're going to need to set this up separately, and that's what this game loop is important for. Now I went ahead and set up 4 command blocks. Each one's going to be unconditional, but we're going to use execute commands to add conditionality, and it's going to be similar to saying if this value is either -1 or +1, then we're going to move the player on that direction. So in order to do so, we're just going to go ahead and start with the x-axis, and we're going to go ahead and do execute. I just typed all this out, and then I remembered the new execute command has just been released. So I'm not sure what this looked like before I set this up. I'm pretty sure there were 3 command blocks up here, but we're just going to go ahead and start with the game loop. Execute if entity at E, and this is basically saying if this entity exists. We're going to go ahead and do type equals armor_stand, and then we're going to say scores only if it has a scores value of x-axis equaling to -1, and then it will run. We want to run the command TP at E, the player, type equals armor stand. Oops, hit caps lock. Armor stand. Name equals player. Then we're going to go ahead and TP him -1 blocks over relative to that player. So in order to get the relative to that player and not the command block, we're going to need to execute at this player. In order to run it as the player, we're going to go ahead and actually just do execute again. And we're just going to do at. I'm pretty sure that's the keyword. If it is not, I will go ahead and fix it for you guys. But then we're just going to go ahead and run TP at S. We're actually probably going to want to do as instead, which will execute the command as that player. Then we're just going to run. So I think if I am correct, let me go ahead and try that. Now I'm going through each one of these chain command blocks. We're setting them up as a chain unconditional always active. I got rid of the hover note, and you want to make sure the delay in ticks is set back to 0 because this first one is already 10. It's only going to execute every 10 ticks. So in our case, we're going to go ahead and go through each one of these ones and change this x-axis scoreboard. And set that to equal to 1, and then we're going to move the player +1. As you can see, that's all we did was change these two values, these ones, and then we're going to go ahead and do that for the forward and backwards, which is going to be +1 is going to correspond to the y-axis on the positive direction, and then we're going to go ahead and do the same thing, which -1 is going to correspond to the y-axis in the negative direction. I'm going to go ahead and test this out by setting the game loop to slower tick and speed. So we're going to go ahead and do it every 2 seconds, which is 40, I'm pretty sure. And we're going to go ahead and go to our spawn, and let's go ahead and see how this runs on our player. So we're going to go ahead and place a armor stand. Bam. And we're going to set up our box so that I can find it. Come on. There we go. Found it. We're going to name our player. And we should see the player start moving. Oop. Did it do it relative to the command block? Bug fixing. Let's go ahead and figure this out. Yep, I was correct. That as statement is incorrect. So this is a perfect time to show you how I bug fix my games. It is relative to the command block. So this statement, execute as this player, is not correct. We want to execute somehow at the position. So I'm assuming we're going to do execute positioned as that, maybe? No, that did not work. Do we need at? And we're just going to go ahead and bug fix this, and you just kind of run it until you figure it out. So I'm going to go ahead and mess around with this, see if I can figure out this new execute command a bit, and I'll tell you guys how I fixed it. Okay guys, I fixed the bug, and it's actually pretty simple. The bug is that we need to execute as the entity, and then we also need to execute at that entity, which we can just do at S. So when we execute as an entity, we're simply executing the command for that entity, but we're not executing it at the position of the entity. So I just need at S after each run or before each run. So we do at S. There we go. And we're just going to do that for each one of these things, and it should work if I understand the command correctly. It's a little bit confusing, and this might not be the best way of doing things. I do need to experiment with this execute command a little bit more, but other than that, that should do the trick. So if we head over to this box and set up our armor stand or our player, go ahead and set him up right in the center. We're going to go ahead and name it player, and you're going to start seeing it moving. And let's go ahead and get in the box. And as you can see, it's moving forward. We move it to the right. Perfect. And we move it backwards. Perfect. And we move it to the left. Perfect. As you can see, we got player input now, and we can move the player however we want. And this might be a fun little mini game for you to try out. And this is all using that events put into scoreboards. Woo-wee, that was a long video. We got a lot done. We have the events all now correspond with an x-axis and y-axis scoreboard value on this new game armor stand. And we also set up a game loop. We also have a nice understanding how our axes correspond to each other. And we now know how this new execute command works, sorta. We can set this stuff up really similarly to what we had previously. And I might go ahead and see if I can find an optimization for this command. This seems a bit long for what I'd like to be doing with this armor stand. But other than that, everything seems to work, and it was nice. I'm glad I got a lot done in today's video, and I hope you guys had a lot of fun making your games. We're going to be continuing this map series with the length of the snake most likely in the next video, but I'm not sure. We'll find out, and we'll see how this game starts to come together. I hope this map is interesting to you, and I hope you guys are making a similar map or making your own maps based off of these tutorials. Maybe it helps you guys understand how inputs can be turned into actions inside of our game. But other than that, thank you guys all for watching, and I'm glad to be posting again. It's been a while since I've posted, so yeah, that's it. You guys have a great day, and goodbye.